You've seen Bigfoot?
I've had an experience with Bigfoot, and we went to mountains up here, but
What was the experience?
this thing comes crashing through the woods. It's making monkey noises. We ended up running away.
It made monkey noises?
Yeah.
3 hunters in the Peruvian Amazon saw something change shape in front of them. It stood upright, then it dropped. Then it became something else entirely. The whole thing lasted less than 40 minutes. The report sat in a police log for 6 years. Then the evidence reached a lab. Then it reached Joe Rogan. He went silent for 8 full seconds before he said a word. 3 ordinary men. The 3 men were not researchers, wildlife trackers, or tourist guides. They were subsistence hunters from a river community of fewer than 200 people in Peru's Loreto region. At the time, they were 29, 34, and 41 years old. 2 had completed only primary school, while the 3rd had studied for 2 years in secondary school. None had any professional connection to wildlife biology, and none had an obvious reason to invent a complicated story. What they did have was something that could not easily be learned from a textbook: decades of practical knowledge of the forest. They knew how animals sounded at different hours. They knew how species moved through thick vegetation and how their behavior changed when they sensed danger. They could recognize tracks in wet clay, dry soil, and soft riverbanks. They could even tell animals apart by the marks they left behind. A tapir path looked different from a peccary trail. The depth, shape, and spacing of footprints could reveal what had passed through an area and how recently it had been there. This experience mattered because the forest was their workplace and their source of food. They spent years moving through places where mistakes could have serious consequences. They learned to notice small details that outsiders might easily miss. So when the 3 hunters later described something unusual, their background made the account difficult to dismiss as simple confusion. These were not inexperienced visitors who had wandered into the jungle and mistaken one animal for another. They knew the forest. They knew its sounds, tracks, and movements. They knew what normally belonged there. And that is what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. The night of June 11. The date was the 11th of June 2017. The location was roughly 40 kilometers from the nearest road, near a seasonal tributary connected to the Napo River. The area was remote, thick with forest, and far from regular human activity. The night was clear and humid. The 3 hunters had been sitting near a small clearing they knew well and used regularly. They had already been hunting for several hours, but the forest had been unusually quiet. There had been little movement and almost no useful activity. Then, one of the men noticed a shape at the edge of the clearing. At first, it looked almost human. The figure was tall and standing upright on 2 legs. It moved along the tree line with a gait that resembled a person walking, but something about the movement seemed wrong. The shoulders appeared unusually high, the arms looked too long, and the body proportions did not resemble those of a normal human. The 3 men watched without moving. For roughly 90 seconds, the figure continued along the edge of the trees. Then something happened that changed what they believed they were seeing. The figure began lowering itself toward the ground. According to their account, it did not suddenly run or vanish into the forest. Instead, the movement was slow and deliberate. As the body dropped, its shape appeared to change. The limbs shifted position, the body stretched outward, and the upright figure became a large animal moving on 4 legs. The hunters were now looking at what appeared to be a massive quadruped, but they could not identify it. Its body seemed unusually large, with thick limbs and a heavy frame. Its movements were slow and powerful. They said it did not move like the large cats they knew from the region, and its shape did not resemble any other animal they could confidently identify. For approximately 37 minutes, they continued watching from their position. The animal moved in and out of view along the clearing's edge. At times, vegetation partially blocked their sight, but they continued to track its movements. It did not appear to notice the 3 men watching from the darkness. Eventually, the animal turned toward the dense undergrowth. It entered the vegetation and disappeared. The hunters remained where they were. They did not attempt to follow it. They did not return to the forest path. Instead, they stayed together until first light, when they finally felt safe enough to leave the area. What they did next. When daylight finally came, the three hunters returned to the area where they had seen the figure. What they found on the ground made the experience even harder to explain. Near the tree line, the soft river clay contained a series of fresh tracks. The impressions were large, clearly defined, and much bigger than the tracks they were used to seeing in that part of the forest. The men did not simply look at the tracks and leave. They carefully examined the impressions and compared them with what they already knew about local animals. Nearby, they cut fresh clay from the banks of a small stream. They pressed the clay into several of the footprints, trying to create rough casts that could preserve the shape and size of the tracks. Before leaving, they also marked several trees with machete cuts so they could recognize the location if they returned later. Then they walked out of the forest and reported what had happened. The nearest outpost received their account the following afternoon. The report was passed to two visiting biologists, who were asked to consider possible explanations. Their official conclusion was misidentification. The most likely possibilities suggested were a large anteater moving in an unusual posture or a spectacled bear seen under poor lighting conditions. One officer added another explanation to the official log. Folklore, he suggested, might have influenced the hunters' perception of what they had witnessed. In other words, the men may have seen an ordinary animal but interpreted it through stories and beliefs familiar to their community. The case might have ended there. No one from the outpost traveled to the site to inspect the tracks. The rough casts made by the hunters were never collected or examined by specialists. No photographs were taken, and no physical evidence was added to the report. The account simply entered the local record and remained there. The three hunters returned to their community, but they did not forget the event. Instead, they began writing down everything they remembered. They recorded the time, the location, the animal's movements, and the details of the tracks, while the memory was still fresh. Years later, those notes would become important because they provided something the original report lacked: a detailed account written by the people who had actually been there. 6 years of notebooks. They returned to the site 7 more times over the following 14 months. Each time they recorded what they found: date, weather, moon phase, track measurements, any secondary signs like broken vegetation, disturbed soil, or unusual smells. By 2019, they had filled 4 school supply notebooks. They had produced 11 plaster track casts. The casts ranged from 38 to 52 centimeters in length. They kept every cast and every notebook. The work was slow and patient. It was the same kind of attention they brought to reading the forest floor on any normal hunting day. They applied it here because something had happened that they could not explain, and they did not think the explanation was going to come from doing nothing. Their families treated it as background fact. Strange and persistent, but part of the household. Some relatives suggested they stop. 2 suggested burning the notebooks. They kept everything. In 2020, a single shared smartphone became available in the community. They began making phone audio recordings at the site on subsequent visits. The video quality was low, but the audio captured something. A repeated low sound at irregular intervals, not a bird, not a known mammal call. The frequency range would later be analyzed with inconclusive but unusual results. 2 other hunting parties in the same 30-kilometer radius reported similar things between 2019 and 2022. Neither report lasted as long as the original observation. Neither produced physical evidence. Both described the same transition from bipedal to quadrupedal movement. No one with the ability to act on the information was paying attention. The gap between what the hunters had and what institutions were equipped to receive was large. It was not created by bad faith on either side. Wildlife authorities in the Loreto region handle hundreds of reports each year. Most misidentifications come from exactly the conditions present on June 11: nighttime, stress, unclear light, animals behaving unusually. The standard categories of explanation existed for good reasons. They accounted for the vast majority of unusual sighting reports correctly. Physical evidence like track casts, collected by untrained observers without controlled conditions and without institutional chain of custody, does not meet the standard required for formal investigation. This is also a reasonable standard. Without it, every piece of physical evidence in every investigation would be equally suspect. The three hunters were not operating within the system that would have given their evidence weight. They were too remote. Their credentials were not academic. Their documentation methods were not standard. The gap between what they had seen and measured and what could be officially examined sat open for 6 years. The notebooks and casts sat in their outbuilding. The report sat in the local police log. The data existed. No one with the tools to evaluate it was looking at it. The handoff. In early 2023, a cousin of one of the hunters was studying biology at a university in Iquitos. He had heard the strange story many times during family gatherings, but he had never seen the physical evidence himself. Curious about what had actually been found, he asked the hunters to show him their old track casts and notebooks. The hunters still had some of the material. They gave him access to 2 of the casts and a small hair sample that had been collected around the same time. The cousin took the material to a university contact who knew researchers working with wildlife remains and unusual animal tracks. That contact passed the material to a visiting researcher who was already studying Pleistocene megafauna remains and unusual modern trackways. The researcher did not immediately claim that the tracks belonged to an unknown animal. Instead, the samples were examined and measured over one long weekend. The measurements were then compared with published data on Megatherium and Eremotherium, 2 of the largest known genera of giant ground sloths. These enormous animals once lived across South America and were part of the continent's Pleistocene megafauna. Giant ground sloths were unlike anything alive in the Amazon today. Some species were enormous, with Megatherium specimens estimated to have reached around 6 meters when standing upright. Their fossils have been found across several parts of South America, showing that these animals once occupied a huge range of environments. The comparison produced an unexpected result. Several important ratios measured from the casts fell within the range reported for giant ground sloth tracks. The match was not exact, and the researcher did not treat it as proof that a giant sloth had survived into modern times. There were differences in the shape and proportions that still needed to be explained. But another detail stood out. No known living South American mammal produced measurements in the same general range as the casts. The tracks appeared too large and unusual to fit comfortably within the normal range of modern species. The researcher recorded the finding and continued working with the material. The casts were not declared evidence of a surviving prehistoric animal. Instead, they became something more interesting, an unexplained set of measurements that did not fit the obvious modern answers. For the first time, the hunter's old story had reached someone willing to examine the physical evidence. What the lab found. By mid-2023, the material was examined more formally. The investigation now involved several different types of evidence: the track measurements, the hair samples, and an audio recording connected to the original account. Each piece was studied separately before being compared with the others. The hair samples had been collected at the site in 2018 and again in 2021. Under magnification, they showed a mixture of unusual traits. The guard hairs were coarse and did not closely resemble samples from jaguars, tapirs, or giant anteaters. Researchers also compared them with available information about giant ground sloth hair. That comparison failed to produce a clear match as well. There was an important limitation. Very little confirmed hair material from giant ground sloths exists for comparison, so the absence of a match could not completely rule anything out. The researchers therefore treated the hair as unidentified rather than claiming it belonged to an unknown animal. The audio clip produced a similarly uncertain result. Researchers analyzed its frequency range and the pattern in which the sound repeated. The recording did not clearly match known species from the region. The calls appeared at irregular intervals, and the pattern did not fit the usual behavior of animals most likely to produce deep or low sounds in that part of the Amazon at night. Still, the audio was not considered proof of anything unusual. Background noise, recording quality, distance, and environmental conditions could all affect the result. The track evidence remained the strongest part of the case. Researchers compared the measurements from the casts with osteological data and museum casts associated with giant ground sloths. Several important ratios showed an overlap that was difficult to reproduce using the known living mammals of the region. That did not mean the tracks came from a surviving Megatherium or Erematherium. The measurements were not an exact match, and the fossil animals disappeared from South America thousands of years ago. Instead, the comparison raised a narrower question. Why did the modern tracks share certain proportions with an extinct group of enormous ground-dwelling mammals? The working hypothesis remained cautious. Something outside the current inventory of known living Amazonian fauna appeared to have left measurable physical traces, but the evidence could not identify what that something was. The closest biological parallel in the fossil record was a giant ground sloth. The data could establish that similarity, but it could not explain it. Then the material took another step. Someone connected to a major podcast received the recordings, photographs, notes, and measurements. What had started as a forgotten local report was about to reach a much larger audience. The 8 seconds. Joe Rogan heard the translated account from the hunters and the preliminary lab notes in a 2023 episode. He listened to the full account. The June 11 observation. The 37 minutes of intermittent watching. The transition from upright to quadruped. The track casts. The measurements. The hair. The audio. The 6 years of notebooks. Then he was quiet for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of silence on a podcast where conversation moves fast is a significant pause. Anyone who has watched the program knows how rarely it happens. It was not performed silence. It was the pause of someone processing information that did not have an obvious response waiting for it. When he spoke, his first question was careful. He asked about the chain of custody for the physical evidence. He asked about the conditions during the original observation. He asked about the other hunting parties who had reported similar things. He did not dismiss the account. He did not overstate it either. He sat with it. That 8 seconds became the most shared moment from the episode. The shape-shifting tradition. The title of this video uses the word Skinwalker. That word comes from Navajo tradition, specific to the American Southwest. The 3 hunters in Peru were not working within that framework. Their community had its own traditions about the forest and the things that moved through it, traditions that included figures capable of changing form. The shape-shifting traditions of Amazonian indigenous communities are not identical to the Navajo Skinwalker concept, but they occupy the same cultural space. They are accounts of entities that do not fit the fixed categories of ordinary animals or ordinary humans. They appear at the edges of cleared land, and at night, they do not behave predictably. Some accounts describe them as moving between forms. When the 3 hunters saw something shift from upright to quadruped in front of them, their immediate interpretive frame for the experience was drawn from the traditions of their own community. The language they used to describe it to the police was shaped by that frame. The officer who noted folklore influence in the log was responding to that language. The laboratory analysis did not engage with the cultural frame at all. It engaged only with the physical evidence. The measurements did not care what the hunters called, what they saw. The measurements either overlapped with giant ground sloth data, or they did not. They did. The 2 things, the cultural account and the physical evidence, were separate lines of information pointing in a similar direction. Neither proved the other. Together, they produced a picture that had no clean explanation. The skeptical objections to this case are real, and they deserve direct engagement. Misidentification under stress and low light is the most straightforward explanation for the original observation. The human visual system makes errors at night. Stress alters perception. Large animals under duress move in unusual ways. A spectacled bear rising to stand and then dropping back to four legs could produce an impression of a shape transition in low light and at distance. The track casts lack continuous chain of custody. They were made by untrained observers without controlled methods and stored in a thatched outbuilding for years before reaching a researcher. The possibility of accidental or deliberate alteration cannot be ruled out through the available evidence. The hair samples are too few and too degraded for definitive DNA sequencing with the methods that were available in 2023. Morphological comparison under basic magnification is not a reliable identification method on its own. Cultural expectations of shape-shifting entities can shape perception. The hunter's interpretive framework may have structured what they believed they saw in ways that do not correspond to what actually happened. These objections are all legitimate. They are the reasons that no one involved in the analysis has claimed proof. They are the reasons the technical note circulating since 2024 has remained in draft form. The evidence is real. The alternative explanations are also real. The case sits in the space between them.
The main thing we've experienced is balls of light. One of these orbs actually landed. It became a cloud, a misty cloud, a black cloud, swirled around, coalesced into the shape of a wolf, which is now standing directly in front of us.
What the pattern shows. The strongest part of the case is not the hunter's original observation. It is the 7 years of follow-up records they kept afterward. The three men returned to the same area several times. Each visit was documented in notebooks, and they preserved the casts they had made from the tracks. When researchers later compared measurements from different visits, they noticed something unusual. The stride length and spacing between the claw marks changed slightly over the years, but the overall proportions remained consistent. This suggested that the tracks were not simply the result of one strange event. Whatever had been making them appeared to return to the area on an irregular cycle. The measurements pointed toward a consistent physical source appearing at different times. The hunters were not the only people to report something unusual. Two other hunting groups from the same general sector described similar encounters. According to the records, the groups had no known coordination with the original hunters, yet their accounts contained specific details about an animal appearing upright before moving on four legs. Those details were especially interesting because they had not appeared in the original public report. That made it harder to argue that the later witnesses had simply copied the first story. There was, however, an important problem. Wildlife researchers had already placed camera traps across parts of the region. None of those cameras recorded anything clearly matching the reported animal. For skeptics, this remains one of the strongest objections to the case. But camera traps have limits. They are usually placed along known animal trails, water sources, and areas where researchers expect wildlife to pass. An animal moving through the forest on an irregular route could easily avoid them. So the mystery remained unresolved. For years, the evidence existed quietly in notebooks, casts, recordings, and memories. It was not discovered through a major expedition or advanced technology. Instead, it resurfaced because one biology student decided to ask his cousin to show him the old notebooks. The bigger question: giant ground sloths went extinct approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago. The accepted scientific record places their disappearance at the end of the Pleistocene epoch, likely due to a combination of climate change and human hunting pressure as populations moved into South America for the first time. The accepted record is based on fossil evidence. Fossils document the bones of animals that died and were preserved in conditions that allowed mineralization. They do not document every animal that lived in a region or every species that may have persisted in isolated populations beyond the main period of extinction. Several megafauna species have had their accepted extinction dates revised as new fossil finds extended the known timeline of their presence. Woolly mammoths survived in isolated populations on islands in the Arctic thousands of years after they disappeared from mainland populations. The coelacanth, a fish believed extinct for 65 million years, was found alive in 1938. The okapi was not known to Western science until 1901. The Amazon basin remains one of the least surveyed large ecosystems on Earth. None of this proves that a giant ground sloth is alive in northern Peru. It establishes that the category of known survivors from past eras is not empty, and that the Amazon is a place where the unknown has repeatedly turned out to be real. The track measurements are what they are. The hair is what it is. The audio is what it is. The observations of 4 independent groups in the same sector over 7 years are what they are. The data does not fit the expected categories. The question of what it actually represents is still open. Where things stand. The 3 hunters still live in the same community. 2 of them continue to hunt the same sector of forest. They have not stopped recording observations. The track casts and notebooks are now stored under controlled conditions. A short technical note has been in circulation in draft form since late 2024. It has not been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The researchers involved are being careful. The evidence supports further investigation. It does not yet support a formal claim. Joe Rogan's 8 seconds of silence has been clipped and shared hundreds of thousands of times. Most people who encounter the case encounter it through that moment first. The silence became a kind of shorthand for the feeling the case produces. Not certainty, not dismissal, the specific pause of encountering something that does not fit the available boxes. The 3 men who kept their notebooks for 6 years are the reason the case exists at all. They had no credentials. They had no institutional support. They had physical evidence that no one wanted to collect, and a report that was filed and forgotten. They kept measuring anyway. They kept writing it down. The thing they saw changed shape in front of them. The measurements they made do not match any living animal in the official record. The explanation for that gap is still waiting to be found. 3 hunters kept records, made casts, and returned repeatedly. Years later, researchers examined their evidence. The measurements still defy known species, leaving the mystery unresolved. Subscribe, because the next part of this story is still being written, and we are not done following it.